I'm going to flip through this deck, and I want you to see one card, and not this one. That's too obvious. Pay close attention. That was too fast. I'll do it again. Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, did you see one?
Yes.
Do you have one in mind?
Yes.
Now, do you see your card here?
No.
That's because you're looking too closely. And what have I been telling you all night? The closer you look, the less you see.
Hey guys, Paperboy is back again to do a quick video response to the debate Ijaz Ahmed had with Stephen Aikens. I wanted you to watch this scene because it sums up the misdirection tactic regularly employed by the Dawah team, especially by the likes of Ijaz Ahmed with his so-called historical methodological approach. But the aim is to get you to focus so much on a conjecture, it takes your attention away from an accepted methodology or overall point.
Jonathan, if you will forgive me, I actually asked you, how do you get to this early dating? And all you've done, you didn't answer the question. And then you put back the question to me, how do I date it? But I'm not the one making the claim. It's
But you're the one that's in the fringe position.
No, my position is it reasonable to say, I don't know if Paul wrote it himself or if a scribe wrote it on his behalf. I don't know. I was not there. You're the one making a claim in history, 50s. So I'm saying, Jonathan, please help me. I'm a Muslim, help me.
To the unassuming, it seems like Jonathan can't answer the question, but we know this is a tactic of the Dawah team, again, as we see getting called out here.
You want the kind of course of the conversation to go in a very particular path, so that
James,
when you ask me a question and I give you an answer, you're like, oh no, answer it in this way if you don't mind.
So remember when Mohammed Hijab in his debate with David Wood said,
I knew I was going to have to give you a free Arabic lesson here today. I knew it. And that's why the translators put for, not to the Prophet.
And the Muslims in the audience were shouting, Takbir! Cheering and shouting without realizing he actually confirmed David's point. This is misdirection 101. Ijaz, like many Muslims, when analyzing the historicity of the Bible, often employ a fallacy called ad ignorantium, which is when someone thinks that a specific belief is true because we don't know that it isn't true, and I'll expand on this later on. Because I want to keep this one brief, I'll just focus on the critical mistakes Ijaz made during this debate. And just like Mohammed Hijab, he ends up refuting himself and highlighting how he holds an untenable position. Let's first listen to the response that Ijaz, a master of sophistry like Lenny Hijab, gives in his first response to the haymaker question asked by Stephen.
Did Jesus die by crucifixion?
That is what historians claim, and that's what historical sources claim, which have survived.
Notice how Ijaz shifts his answer towards the historians, but Stephen is quick on the ball and pushes for a clear answer.
But I'm not asking what historians say, I'm asking what you believe.
What I believe, when it comes to debates, I have theological beliefs and I have methodological beliefs.
You suffer from extreme cognitive dissonance and confirmation bias, which is why you try to go against conventional historical methodological approaches employed by qualified historical scholars to try and justify your untenable position. If Ijaz ever did a peer-reviewed paper on his historical methodological approach, the first place it would appear is in the bin. Ijaz's historical method is solely based on his theological belief, which is why even liberal scholars do not take Ijaz's apparently groundbreaking new historical methodological approach. But let's continue.
So when it comes in terms of the Quran, no, as a Muslim, I do not believe that Christ was crucified.
His opposition is because he's a Muslim, because a confirmation of the crucifixion destroys his whole religious belief. But let's continue.
But I also affirm what the Quran says, that this is a claim which exists in history.
Did you hear that? Let's repeat that moment again.
But I also affirm what the Quran says, that this is a claim which exists in history, which exists in history, in history, in history, in history.
Thank you, Mr. Ijaz. In your own words, you admit there is a high probability that Jesus was crucified. Debate over, case closed. But let us be clear. The probability that the crucifixion happened based on all evidence is so high that all scholars with a worthwhile reputation consider it as a fact of history. But we're not finished just yet. Let's listen to some more of how Ijaz gets himself busted.
I think using probability, it's a high probability that he would have been killed. But as I mentioned in my opening statement, when historians look at continuities in regards to probabilities, they actually point out that things could be outside of the scope of continuities. And therefore, just because something is highly probable does not mean that it is fully possible and therefore absolute.
So, he just said there are things that can happen outside of the historical continuity, which means the evidence is not absolute. And guys, this is the art of misdirection. In other words, Ijaz has just exposed his bias, because it seems by Ijaz's own words, he wants absolute evidence when he knows historically this is impossible with pretty much every historical event of antiquity and beyond, therefore destroying the credibility of his own historical methodological approach. But to his uninformed Islamic audience, they would believe he's making a valid point. This is why historians such as Will Durant, for example, state that higher criticism has applied to the New Testament a test of authenticity so severe that by them 100 ancient worthies, for example, Hammurabi, David, and Socrates would all fade into legend. And this is where Stephen catches him out on with his next question.
Okay, so you want a 100% certainty that Jesus died by crucifixion?
Repeat that question again.
You want a 100% certainty that Jesus died by crucifixion?
Am I allowed to ask you what you mean by that? Let me answer. Maybe you can clarify.
Clarify it.
So what I don't understand in regards to the question is, are you asking me in regards to my belief as a Muslim, or are you asking me as when I do use the historical method?
You see how he starts playing dumb? Of course, it's using the historical method, the one that you apparently claim you have been using to bring the historicity of the crucifixion into question. So let's continue.
So using the historical method based on the principle of continuities, scholars would generally say that it is more probable than less probable that he died.
Okay, what is your position on that then?
My position that it is probable, as is the position of all scholars.
So there we have it, guys. Ijaz believes the crucifixion is probable in accordance with scholars. But Ijaz believes it's not something that happened. But then he's saying it's probable. But then the scholars have confirmed it's pretty much a fact of history. So Ijaz has just debunked himself and weeks worth of live streams in a few seconds.
Does Tacitus claim that Pilate crucified Jesus? He suffered the severe punishment.
That's what he says, but as I duly pointed out in my, my first rebuttal and second rebuttal, historians agree that that section of the text contains both a truth and a lie, and that his claim, one of his claims basically, was politically motivated.
But he does make the claim that Jesus died by crucifixion, or died.
He
died under Pontius Pilate.
And he writes that almost 80 to 90 years after the fact. I'm not sure how that is meant to be weighty.
What evidence would you accept that Jesus died by crucifixion? As certain as we can come to anything that happens historically.
So that's a difficult question because it's a hypothetical. What the thing is, with historical sources, we can actually only have literary sources, and we can have archaeological evidence, because our literary sources are so long after the time of Jesus, and because the archaeological evidences themselves are either non-existent or too long afterwards. I would say that generally that is what historians would seek to use, but I cannot answer a hypothetical without some frame of reference.
Notice how he tries to obfuscate his answer by saying the scholars say it's more probable than less probable that he died. Almost like Ijaz is wanting to fool us into believing that they have a sort of 49% belief. So let's actually see what some of the actual scholars say. Liberal Jesus Seminar scholar John Dominic Crossan admits that the crucifixion of Jesus is historical and as sure as anything historical can be, in his book The Historical Jesus. Gerd Ludemann acknowledges that even though he does not accept many of the truth claims of Christianity, he has no doubts that Jesus Christ really lived and really died. He has written that Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. And Professor Bar Ehrman states, one of the most certain facts of history is that Jesus was crucified on the orders of Pontius Pilate. Does that sound like the way Ijaz phrased it? Nope. And this is how you blow away the misdirection point blank. And, it seems like Ijaz takes this position just in order to throw in conjecture, because he tries to say that the crucifixion never happened. But, he should go and write a tafsir, because even his own greatest scholars seem to have the opinion that there was a crucifixion. But Ijaz knows he plays to conjecture to make his point. Because if we go to, for example, people like Ibn Abbas, who was the greatest scholar of his time, he says, Allah destroyed their man Tatianos. Allah made Tatianos look like Jesus, and so they killed him instead of him. Al-Jalalain, he says, and yet they did not slay him, nor did they crucify him. But he, the one slain and crucified, was an associate of theirs. In other words, God cast Jesus' likeness to him, and he thought it was him. And then we go to Ibn Kathir, and he pretty much claims the same thing. He says, we killed Al-Masih, Isa son of Maryam, the Messiah, meaning we killed the person who claimed to be the messenger of Allah. He says the Jews uttered these words in jest and mockery, just as the polytheists said. So he clearly goes against even his own Islamic scholarship. And people like Ijaz, who utilize this technique to make it appear that their position is tenable. But in reality, they simply confuse possibility with probability, and the ignorant Muslims in the audience fall for this all the time. A case of the blind leading the blind, or the closer you look, the less you see.
The crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth is one of the best attested facts in ancient history. And I speak as an ancient historian. There are certain other things like the murder of Julius Caesar, the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, all sorts of other things which actually we know pretty certainly and which no ancient historian denies. I gather there is yet another book just come out, I can't even remember the author's name, saying that Jesus never existed, saying that this was all invented 70 years later by the Romans in order to keep people quiet. This is complete nonsense, and no serious ancient historian would take it seriously for a minute. If we take Jesus out of the world of first century Palestinian Judaism and say maybe such a figure never existed. There are 1,000 other things that we just simply can't explain. We have all sorts of evidence which points back to the certainty of there being this figure, and particularly the certainty of his crucifixion. The crucifixion itself is one of the best bits of evidence, because in the ancient world, the word cross or crucifixion was almost like a swear word. You wouldn't want to say it in polite company or in front of your grandmother, because it was so horrible and barbaric and disgusting, and bodies hanging on crosses being eaten by rats and vermin and birds and so on. You just shudder and look away. And yet the Christians made the cross the symbol from the very beginning of their movement, because for them it was the sign of the love of God. Without something like the actual death of Jesus, that cultural shift is impossible to explain.
Now, Ijaz did an article on the historicity of the Kaaba. Let us look at his historical, methodological approach in action. And I'll just skip some parts, and it goes to the point where it says, Reverend Charles Augustus Goodrich, a Christian, was an American author and congregational minister, comments on Kaaba and Mecca. Although he is not fond of Prophet Muhammad, but he is sincere in admitting that the Kaaba existed at the time of patriarchs. What does this person have to do with knowing history? He's just some sort of reverend. And that is the level of scholarship Ijaz applies when it comes to Islam. Quoting a sincere Christian, as he put it. Now, if he actually employed his own so-called methodological approach to his article, he wouldn't have even wasted time writing it. And this is why we call into question the game of smoke and mirrors. So, I am sorry to say, Ijaz, but the Donkey of the Day award has certainly got to go to you.
We understand this is a narrative that you believe theologically, but there's no historical background and foundation for this. And this is just demonstrated every time somebody says, okay, look, it may not be historical, but we just, it serves a purpose, it gives a point. That's a perfect answer, because you say, okay, this is not history. This is a narrative that you guys just believe based on faith.
Yes.
Okay, this is the verse. This is the verse, yeah?
Okay.
All right, this is the King James Version, so I don't know whether it changes with their other versions. But anyway, then behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth quaked, and the rocks were split, and the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the graves, after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many.
SubhanAllah, yeah.
Guys, did you see what they did? Exactly what I said they would do. Because they know history is not an absolute thing. So now they have created a narrative that the crucifixion is not historical, and that donkey Ijaz is nodding his head. But he already admitted in a debate the crucifixion probably did happen based on evidence. What a scam. And this is exactly what I was saying. This argument where they present their conjecture as evidence, which it's not. So on that note, I don't think there's anything else to say. Ijaz has admitted the biblical narrative gives a greater historical account than the Quran. So why would anyone in their right mind believe the Quran? Yep, Muslims only have a theological argument. Facts don't care about your delusions. And that's all, folks. Until next time, they can't hack the hack, and Jesus Christ is Lord. Paperboy signing out.
But I also affirm what the Quran says, that this is a claim which exists in history, in history.